Hi, I'm Dr. G, your mad shrink. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist here to offer you information and advice about mental health and to challenge your assumptions. And today I'll be talking about anorexia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa, as most of you know, is a psychiatric condition, a dysfunction that involves a preoccupation with one's bodily health that leads to self-starvation or urges for self-starvation. I'll be pinpointing anorexia nervosa today much more than I will other forms of so-called eating disorders like bulimia or bulimia nervosa, because there's just too much to talk about otherwise. Now, anorexia nervosa really came to my attention many years ago when I was in medical school during the Punic Wars in the late 1960s, in which our class was seated in an auditorium during a psychiatry lecture, and a professor brought out onto the stage a young woman whom he introduced as having anorexia nervosa. And they sat down and he interviewed her. And the idea was that she was such an exotic curiosity that we might never see anybody with anorexia nervosa again during our training. And so he wanted us at least to see one person with that. And it is true for the rest of medical school, internship, and at least the portion of internal medicine residency I did, I never saw another person I identified as having anorexia nervosa. Now it's, well, not common. It's relatively commonplace for people to know of somebody or other who has had this kind of problem. It's no longer an exotic curiosity. The psychiatric profession struggled to figure out how to help these people for quite a while, up until, I would say, the 1970s. The primary approach of the field collectively was to employ some sort of Freudian psychoanalytic or psychodynamic psychotherapy, including perhaps even psychoanalysis, in order to help these people, and psychiatry failed utterly. And I'll explain why by and by. But then a curious thing happened. In 1978, 3 separate books came out that opened the door towards other approaches. The first that I'll mention was written by Dr. Hilda Bruch, B-R-U-C-H. She was a professor of psychiatry at Baylor, and she wrote some books, probably best known being The Golden Cage. It's still available. It's a good read, and it's worth a read. And she described a different psychotherapeutic approach for these individuals, one that did not really look into their backgrounds for unconscious conflicts, past traumas, for the most part, but rather supported them in their efforts to establish their own sense of autonomy and self-regulation. She found these were people who struggled with knowing what they wanted, what they needed, what they didn't want or need, what they liked, what they didn't like. And with this tenuous sense of self, she felt it was more useful for the therapist to support them in their efforts to resolve these issues than for the therapist to tell them, well, you feel this way because you were angry at your mother for X, Y, and Z, which went against what these individuals were struggling with, which was to find themselves, not be told who they were by another person. So this was a breakthrough of sorts. Unfortunately, not all therapists were as gifted as Dr. Bruch, and this model in general did not produce results really worth writing home about. But as I say, in 1978, there were two other books that were published that had a stronger impact on the discovery of ways to help these people. And they were written by family therapists. Family therapy was a mode of therapy increasing in popularity, perhaps in part because of the societal interest in cybernetics and systems theory. And one book that I'll mention from 1978 was Psychosomatic Families, written by Dr. Salvador Minuchin, Minuchin. His books are all over the internet. And he worked primarily out of the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic, also other places. And he formulated and developed a system of therapy called structural family therapy, which attempted a therapeutic alteration of the structural arrangements among the family members, the families of the individuals who were anorexic. And he treated, obviously, people with other problems, but psychosomatic families was mainly about this. And he would have sessions with the families and the, as it was called, the identified patient, sometimes over a meal, in order to help them understand and alter their interactions around food. This was an extremely effective form of therapy, as I can attest. I performed this type of therapy in my office in young women mainly. This is a disorder more of females than males, with young women, either teens or college age, and their families, including over food. Very, very effective. The second, or rather third book in 1978 was written by Dr. Mara Selvini Palazzoli in conjunction with her team. They were from and worked in Milan, Italy, and they developed a form of therapy we could call systemic family therapy. And their model included working as a team so that one therapist interviewed the anorexic young woman, usually, sometimes a young man, while the rest of them sat behind a one-way mirror and served as a kind of Greek chorus, so that from time to time, and especially at the end of the session, they would make recommendations, and they and the therapist in the room would provide the family and the identified patient with a prescribed ritual they were to carry out pertaining to the patient's problem. There was a very considerable use of paradox in their interventions, and they were almost uniformly effective with all of their anorexic patients. They had huge rates of success, so much so that one must assume they got bored with treating anorexics and they turned to the treatment of young psychotic people, including young schizophrenic people, children, teens and young adults with their families, and they also had considerable success helping these people become well through family therapy alone. Now, why haven't we heard more about all of this? Why, if we look around this country at least, we don't see more therapists practicing these models? They really work well. People with anorexia nervosa have gotten well from them, and I chalk that up in part to our healthcare system, which does not motivate multiple health practitioners to participate in that kind of team approach, because who's going to pay for it? Certainly not your friendly insurance company or the departments in which they work if they're in academic settings. And I am afraid to say that a number of therapists have fallen under the sway of conventional psychiatry and don't dare take unconventional approaches such as I've described, and more if somebody's mentally ill, they refer them to a psychiatrist for medication. And some of Mara Palazzoli and her group's work and Salvador Minuchin's work, some of it is still being carried on, but I think it's a real shame that it's not more prevalent. What can we say about the statistics of anorexia nervosa? Its prevalence in our population is estimated between 0.9% to 4.2%. The prevalence of all eating disorders, including bulimia and bulimia nervosa and anorexia, has been estimated between 4 and 9% in our population, among females, I should say. So close to 1 in every 10 females, at least up to that figure, may have some sort of eating disorder. What is most worth mentioning is that anorexia nervosa has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder, beating out bipolar disorder by a little bit, but 20% of anorexics will end up committing suicide. So a rate of 18 times suicide compared with the general population that doesn't have eating disorders. So this is really a grave problem. When diagnosed, after being diagnosed, 5 to 10% of anorexics die within the first 10 years of diagnosis. They are also mortality from medical complications that occur as a result of the self-starvation. So it's these two factors primarily that determine this alarming mortality rate. What's the outlook if you have anorexia nervosa? The University of California in San Francisco did a study over time in which they found that in 2019 they published this, in which about 21% of the anorexics they followed fully recovered, and the rest only partially recovered and were unfortunately subject to relapses. Other studies have shown that the recovery rate within the first 4 years of diagnosis is about a third. These studies, however, do not make a point of how was their mental health in other respects. Were they happy? Were they productive? And so on. So we're talking really about statistics for the anorexic symptoms themselves. Here are two takeaway points, I think, that characterize this population of people who suffer from this problem and their families. And the first I mentioned was described to some extent by Hilda Bruch, but it involves these individuals' central problem of separation and individuation, to use kind of psychotherapeutic jargon. Separation and individuation. What does that mean? That a high percentage, not all, but a high percentage have difficulties separating themselves from others in terms of awareness, as I said earlier, of their likes, dislikes, wants, needs, things they don't want or need, and in their developing a sense of autonomy of themselves as independent, self-regulating people. So it's no wonder you could see why that people start to run into trouble with anorexia nervosa when they're teens or very earliest years of adult life, because that's when you have to deal with these things. Who are you? You're facing the task of separating from your family, if you can, and establishing an independent role for yourself in the world. an independent role as opposed to still being attached to your family, which is what those family therapists, the effective ones that I mentioned, worked on. Second takeaway point is that the families in which anorexics are raised tend, not every single one, but tend to be characterized by what's termed in the psychotherapeutic lingo as pseudo-mutuality. Pseudo-mutuality. What that means is an intolerance of difference. These are typically families, and again, there's an exception for everything I say, but these are families that tend to operate as an inseparable unit in that there's very little disagreement about anything, let alone any expression of any differences which are considered threatening. Typically, these families appear to get along just great with each other, no muss, no fuss, no strife. So that's why it's called pseudo-mutuality. They don't really deal with each other as separate, autonomous, independent people. So you could imagine how difficult it would be for somebody vulnerable to a problem like anorexia nervosa to negotiate her way through separating from such a family. So separation and individuation and pseudo-mutuality are key concepts. Now, the modern psychiatric approach is one in which the problem is considered a thing, an entity, an abstract noun, and that's what anorexia is. You can't see or feel, smell, touch anorexia nervosa. It's an abstraction. It's an abstract noun, as are all psychiatric diagnostic labels. They don't exist in the real world. They're concepts. And so psychiatry views anorexia nervosa this way, as an abstract entity instead of a process or dysfunction, unlike the successful family therapists that I mentioned earlier. Psychiatric drugs have been, for the most part, ineffectual in helping these people. And except for there are other eating disorders that have been somewhat successfully influenced by SSRI antidepressants, particularly fluoxetine or Prozac, where we're talking about bulimia, for example, not anorexia nervosa. So we may be dealing with somewhat different populations of people. The one among many problems with the use of pharmaceuticals for anorexics is, remember, they are struggling to develop their nascent sense of independence and autonomy. And what better way to sabotage that than to give them a chemical, a pharmaceutical, that is designed to coerce their biochemistry to change in ways to minimize symptoms. It goes against their struggle to find autonomy. Now, again, differentiating anorexia nervosa from other eating disorders, there are varieties of psychotherapy, individual psychotherapy, that have been found useful for people with other eating disorders. Again, bulimia nervosa particularly, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, but not limited to that. So if you are suffering from anorexia nervosa or are close to somebody who does, this may seem, what I've been saying may seem like a bummer. As I say, if you can find a family therapist who works systemically or structurally, and the anorexic person is still in some way tied with their family, that can be extremely helpful. It's also possible, even if a good therapist meets individually with an anorexic person, if they're older and they're not directly connected with, intimately connected still with their family of origin, it's possible to do family therapy with only the two people in the room, the therapist and the patient. And you can talk about all the different relationships almost as if the other members of the family are still there. But you may have to search hard to find a therapist who does that. However, I would consider that there's considerable room for hope. There are, as I've alluded to in previous podcasts, there are forms of treatment that address the needs of the whole person and do not simply treat abstract nouns with pharmaceuticals. And I'll mention an example of one such case that was treated within the model of functional psychiatry. Functional psychiatry being a systemically oriented and biologically oriented approach to psychiatric problems that investigates and addresses root causes of problems, so that a functional psychiatrist will not see the anorexia nervosa as the basic problem, but will look for the root causes of that, and particularly within the physiology or biochemistry of that person. And it may be that there is an imbalance, an excess or deficiency in certain internal constituents, micronutrients, such as vitamins, trace minerals, amino acids, gut microbiome, that can be corrected. And I'll give you one case example of that. There's a young woman, and she was in high school, and she was suffering from this problem, anorexia nervosa. And her family brought her to see a functional psychiatrist who, as functional physicians are wont to do, ordered a whole battery of lab tests. This young woman was not only was suffering from anorexia, but was quite depressed, was really tired. She had barely enough energy to make it to school each day. And the tests revealed two things. Oh, and I might mention too that part of her problem also was that she would get easily nauseated and bloated in her abdomen. So her digestive system was impaired. So two lab tests revealed a deficient level of the trace mineral zinc in her body, and also a deficient level almost across the board of all the amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein and which play a role in virtually every process in our bodies. So if you don't have enough amino acids, it's very difficult to function. And the functional psychiatrist realized these two deficiencies were linked because zinc plays a major role in regulation of mood. It plays a major role in the transformation of the amino acid tryptophan in your diet to the neurotransmitting chemical that helps regulate mood, serotonin. And without enough zinc, you can't make this transformation, produce enough serotonin. Zinc also plays a significant role in the functioning of your gastrointestinal system, in the production and the activation of stomach acid, and in the activation of the secretion by your pancreas of all the enzymes you need to be able to break down food. So the zinc deficiency was a vicious cycle. So the zinc deficiency was preventing her digestion of the protein in her diet to make amino acids, which would then be the building blocks of everything in her system, including the mood-regulating chemicals in her brain and much else. And as a result, she also began feeling more depressed because amino acids also go into the regulation of neurotransmitters that regulate moods and so much else. So she was prescribed, among other things, a daily hefty dose of free-form amino acids in the form of powder to replenish her minimal supply, and also a zinc supplement every day, plus other recommendations. But those were the key. And her mood improved significantly. Her gastrointestinal symptoms subsided. She felt more energy, and her anorexia nervosa, while we can't say it was truly cured at that point, it was much less of an issue, and she was able and willing to eat in a more healthy fashion. So that would be an example of a functional psychiatric approach, and there are other forms of systemic medicine as well. So at any rate, I hope that I've given you some food for thought, and this is Dr. G, your mad shrink, wishing you well, and I will see you next time.